Ladies and gentlemen, the ISAS seminar will commence shortly. May we invite you to take your seats and request that you kindly switch off all mobile phones and other electronic devices. Thank you. A very good afternoon to our special guest, Dr. S Jaishankar, Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman of ISAS, His Excellency Javed Ashraf, High Commissioner of India to Singapore, Professor C. Raja Mohan, Director, ISAS, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Vani and I have the pleasure of being your MC today. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies at NUS, I welcome you to this afternoon's event titled In Conversation with Dr. S. Jaishankar, Distinguished Visiting Research Fellow ISAS, former Foreign Secretary of India, and India's former Ambassador to the United States and China. Dr. Jaishankar will be speaking on the topic, the United States and South Asia, assessing the new dynamics. To start the proceedings, I would like to introduce our moderator, Professor C. Raja Mohan, Director, Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. Mr. J.
It's my reservation. Please, Javed's deputy, Nina.
I will now hand over the floor to Professor Mohan. Professor Mohan, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Vani. High Commissioner, Javed Ashraf, Chairman Pillai, friends, delighted to have you all this afternoon with us for a discussion with Ambassador Jaishankar. We know that one of the most interesting things, if you like, is what's going on in the United States. The US domestic politics and the internal developments in the United States are having a far-reaching effect on global economy, on the international relations in general, and certainly of our region. So therefore, whatever we do today, I think without some sense of where the US is going, it becomes very difficult to understand the logic and the flow of events that is taking place. Because all these decades we have taken the US as a constant, that there is a bandwidth within which the US policies operate. Mr. Trump has fundamentally challenged that assumption, whether it is on question of trade and WTO, whether it is on the question of immigration. We all grew up thinking US is borders are open, every Indian engineer thinks he has a right to work in the United States. From that environment today, we come to an environment that is fundamentally different. And third is a question of intervention. I think the classic post-war sense, all our friends in Washington keep talking about American leadership, which meant that they have an obligation or a divine duty to intervene everywhere, set things right. And Trump is again questioning those kind of assumptions, saying, why are we in Afghanistan? His famous tweet, spend $2 trillion in the Middle East, stupid. Kind of sums up the argument against the kind of interventionary policies the US has pursued in the Middle East. So I think the US is a variable, and that understanding the US becomes critical to see where our own region, that is including Southeast Asia, South Asia, and the Indo-Pacific, if you will go. So I think we have someone who can talk about the US, what's going on in the US with some authority and with some insight and some knowledge. Ambassador Jaishankar served in the US as a first secretary, political, many years ago during Rajiv Gandhi time. He was a joint secretary dealing with the United States. A few years later, he was a foreign secretary, he was ambassador to the US and then the foreign secretary. So I think he had a long experience dealing with the United States. and he's just come back from a long trip to the US. So I'm going to use the next half an hour or so to engage Ambassador Jaishankar. We thought we'll make it a more conversation format, but the side table doesn't give that opportunity. But next time we do this kind of a thing, maybe we'll have just 2 chairs and not this table.
And a fireplace.
Yeah, probably, yeah. So we will just, I'll try and draw him out to get his sense and his insights onto what's happening in the US and what does it mean for the subcontinent. Because the logic of the unfolding logic in the United States will have significant implications for the economic strategies South Asia has adopted, to the nature of its relationships with the other powers, as well as the intra-South Asian relationships. So all these are at stake today. So I'm going to start by asking Ambassador Jaishankar that you've been recently there. You have a sense that given the kind of resistance Trump is facing in the United States, the current policies that he's pursuing, so as outsiders, do we take it as there is a new course? Or our friends, many in Washington, who have said, look, just give it some more time, the adults in the room will take care of it, Trump is an aberration, and that there is we'll go back to the normal. So is it an abnormal situation, or is it a new normal in Washington?
I think it's a new abnormal in Washington. Look, it's actually very interesting to be in Washington because one of the problems is almost everybody you know in Washington doesn't know what's going on. So you actually have to search and find people who have really a sense of the pulse. So I would actually first of all caution anybody in our business to be very careful what they are reading and what they are understanding of the US, because a lot of what we read, what is put out, is actually a kind of a Washington battle which is being fought globally, and it's easy to be misled when there is a civil war going on. Now, having said that, I would say if one actually looks at what the changes are, and you want to kind of connect all the dots, or in this case all the tweets, I think what they give you is a pretty consistent picture. They actually give you a worldview, and the worldview broadly would be this. Number one, very deep opposition to global supply chains. Because the global supply chains are perceived as hollowing out American manufacturing. So now the particular sort of focus of that is China, but it's not just China. I think any part of the global supply chain, anything which takes business out of America, takes manufactured jobs out of America, is seen as negative, therefore NAFTA, etc. The second is resistance to global mobility. So if you put the opposition to global supply chains and resistance to global mobility, the two of them together, actually almost everything is a derivative of these two beliefs, because these two are seen as really harmful to American economic interests. The third, I think, is specific, which is really the rise of China. Now, I won't even say rise of China, I think the challenge of China. I mean, the sense today that, the belief that China could be managed, or China would become normal, I think that belief is gone, that confidence is gone. And particularly as Chinese leaders have, once you get China Dream and, a kind of a China export model, if you would, the sense that today China is taking on the United States, and if you don't respond to this challenge, actually there's a very fundamental interest here at stake. I think there's a larger sense of what we would call, in Asia we've all been sort of with a certain amount of self-congratulation, keep talking of the rise of Asia, which is justified. But perhaps we have not realized that the rise of Asia has had some zero-sum impact on other geographies which were dominant till now. So there is that element, but it's particularly China. And finally, frankly, a lot of it boils down, therefore, to also a certain cultural belief. So you actually have economics, power, and culture all sort of fusing together to sort of create the positions that you have today. And once you have that, and you spoke of the US as a constant. Okay. In a sense, it's more than a constant. It was actually it was a constant, but it was a stabilizing constant. I think you could have a situation where it may still be a constant, but it would be a destabilizing constant. And not a accidental destabilizer, but actually a destabilizer for two reasons. One, a sense that the institutions, the very systems and institutions that the US created, the US founded, the US nurtured, today no longer work for America. And the one, I think, the institution most under attack is the WTO. That the trade system has been gamed. I mean, this is the perception there, that the trade system has been completely gamed by the Chinese, that there's no way you can win in this situation. It was a huge mistake to let China into WTO. This is the narrative which the Trump people have. And therefore, once the great stabilizer now decides to be a full-time destabilizer, then I think you have problems across the world. We in Asia are focusing on China, but I think I spent the week before I went to Washington in Europe. And in Europe, actually the big news was that Matteo Salvini had decided to join Steve Bannon's organization there, and that the right wing of Europe, and that Orban and Salvini had a meeting which had a kind of blessing from the American right. So I think every geography is reacting to it with their particular issues in the forefront. I mean, we have an Asian or a Southeast Asian perspective sitting here. The Europeans have theirs, the Mexicans have theirs, the Canadians have theirs. So this is today really the state of the world.
I mean, I think taking up the trade issue, which has had a big impact for us, I will come back to the question of what it does to South Asia. But first, the general opinion in the US has been that, look, the Trump's policy is a disaster. This thing of trying to wreck the global trading order will end up hurting the US more than others. But what we've seen in the last few days, certainly Mexico seems to have caved in a little bit. There seems to be the Canadians are involved in a negotiation. Chinese are eagerly engaged with them. The Europeans, and there was talk about Europeans, Americans, and the coming together on the WTO related issues. So you see, contrary to the conventional wisdom, is there the rest of the world, is it beginning to adapt? The biggest kid on the block always has when he decides to change the rules of the game, the smaller players have to adapt. Are we seeing that, or is it going to be the general conventional wisdom that US is going to lose in this?
Well, Trump certainly thinks he's winning, okay? And the last tweet is evidence of that. But the fact is that if you look at the Europeans, I think Juncker's visit to Washington and some attempt at sort of blunting the edge of American hostility to EU, you can see moves towards accommodation. I think particularly German auto industry is very concerned. There is that. I would say you've seen with Mexico what's happening. I think the Canadian situation perhaps a little more political here. And I would say, even now where the Chinese are concerned, it's a little more difficult to say anything definitively, because frankly a lot of it is happening below the surface. I think we know that there is activity, but really what is happening there, I'm not sure is that clear. So there is a sense, and the other sense is really, in a broad way, today people may not agree with the tactics and the style, but a broad sense that the US needs to do something on two issues. One, broadly the economy issue to regain its status economy, and two, the US has to do something different to deal with China. I think perhaps you have a broader support base for that than we would imagine. I mean, I'm not sure I would say, that the China issue is a Trump issue alone. I think it has a bigger, broader sense than that. And if you look at some of the, today, some of the legislative enactments today, they have very broad bipartisan support.
So just before we go to China issue, I think this question, I think on the one hand you hear this stories about, reports about a fabulous performance of the US economy. Trump says, look, this is the best ever. And at the same time, you see that, look, Democrats might gain control of the House and talk about impeachment. I mean, when you talk to your colleagues now in your new position, meet with the industrialists, I mean, what is the sense you're getting from the US industry, one, in terms of the changing domestic support base, and the politically, the whole thing could be come into collapse amidst the results in the midterm elections?
Look, the elections, you won't know till the elections are held. Yeah. The economy at least has numbers by which you can get to some kind of objective judgment. I don't think anybody denies that the US economy is doing very well. Now, why it's doing well, we can have a debate on it. But the fact is, it has done, again, as Trump says, yes, beautiful, the best ever, etc. But when US hits 4%, it's not a normal happening. So now I'm not sure. I mean, people would argue there's no direct correlation, or there may not be a correlation between economic performance and political results, because politics has many other variables to it. We don't know. We'll have to wait and see. I mean, and the one thing which the last American elections taught us was really not necessarily to go by what the prognosis was.
As we talked about the US, I mean, China inevitably came into the argument, and I think before we get into the dynamic between the US and China and its impact on South Asia, just one thought on US is not the only variable. I mean, the assumptions about China's constancy, that China was going a particular trajectory, it was on inexorable, inevitable primacy in this region and the world. Has Trump kind of dented that narrative? And internally, what you've been in China as ambassador for 4 years, what kind of an effect is Trump having on the Chinese calculus and on Chinese domestic politics? Because if Chinese politics too becomes a variable, then we are in even a more complicated world than we see at the point.
Well, look, again, I think I would make a distinction. I think China is a variable. Whether Chinese internal politics is a variable, again, we don't know. I mean, all of us read the same stuff, so I think there's been some speculation there. But, when we look at the world today and said, oh, Trump has made a difference. Yes, he has. But I think we should also accept China's made a huge difference. I mean, Chinese behavioral standards have been very different post-2009 and then post-2012. So you see China doing things and saying things which it didn't some years ago. I'm not sure I would completely make this a US. I accept these are the two most powerful countries in the world. But look at it, and I bring you here into South Asia. But look today at the level of Chinese activity in South Asia. Look at the Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean. Look at the China-Pakistan relationship and see how that is ramped up. So I think we also have to accept that there's a sort of Newton's third law of politics. So if there is a enormous push by one player, there are going to be reactions to that, particularly in the neighborhood.
And we're seeing some of that already.
Absolutely.
So in the pushback you talked about, I mean, is there, because there is a question of Europe, which seemed open to what China was doing, where Japan, which is also adapting, I think, to uncertainty in the US as well as in China. and then the Russian factor. I mean, I think how do these three players affect the bigger game between US and China, as well as and its impact on us?
I think Europe was significantly preoccupied by Brexit, but I think now that's become the new normal. So now they are looking at other issues. Certainly, mechanisms like 16+1, where China is really having a particular relationship with the countries which were the old Soviet bloc countries, that has had a kind of a political impact on Europe. I think there are other issues which have clearly led to a somewhat different modified European posture vis-a-vis China. You can, even with UK, you can see a certain, if you were to compare, let us say, where Cameron was on many issues versus where Theresa May is on issues, or where Germany was 5 years ago, where Germany is now today. I think there are changes. You can see that with Japan, at least under Abe, has been a far more consistent course. But the fact is, while everybody is having their derivative issues from what is happening in the US, they're also having in parallel a set of issues with China, and how sort of getting it right between the two is today a big global challenge.
Yeah. Just on one thought on Russia before we go specifically to South Asia. I mean, because all of us in South Asia will have to adapt to, as you said, what's happening between US and China, the change in the US relationship with the major powers. So the worsening tensions between US and Russia, in spite of the president's instinct seemingly towards improved relationship with Putin, and the China-Russia drawing closer, does that create a new set of dynamics for South Asian and other countries to deal with?
Well, look, to me, the big mystery going to Washington is why Washington is so obsessed with Russia. But then this is an Indian speaking. Okay, we've always had a certain understanding of Russia and a certain comfort level of Russia, and you feel somehow that in many ways in Washington people are overreacting, but you also have to understand it's politically a very, sort of a very natural issue in which you would have such a divide.
Our American friends used to tell us about, look, sovereignty is not really important. We're in a globalized world. Everybody intervenes in everybody else's, internal affairs, so there's no big deal. To suddenly, defense of the American sovereignty has become the central theme for the liberals in Washington, hasn't it?
Not just the liberals.
Yeah. So that let me come to South Asia. I think one level we talked about changes taking place in US and China, because one big change from India's response to the Cold War in the past, India was relatively weak, and that it had its choices in dealing with the outside world were limited. It largely had to react and respond to and adapt to the external environment. Does India's own emergence, does it give it more options today of how to deal with a changing US and assertive China? So does your net incremental increase in India's capabilities, does it open up space for us?
Yes, absolutely. I think the fact is that, especially after 2009, in many ways the world is flatter. That there is a much broader distribution of power, and in a way, I would say, if you take the fact that the G7 became the G20, G7 still continue, but really the importance of G7 has gone down. The G20 has become in many ways a much more premier forum. I think that captures, in a sense, a post-2009 transition better than any description I would use. But if I were to look at it in terms of power politics, certainly, first of all, there is much more space between Europe and America. Space within Europe, it is less consolidated than it was. I would say the entry of Japan in a more vigorous way into international affairs has again broadened it out in some ways. Again, where US and China were concerned, for all the difficulties, to the extent that there is competition between them in overall power terms, that gives other players more choices. And most of all, India's own capability and confidence has grown. So if you were to look just at this year, you have on the one hand Wuhan meeting where Prime Minister Modi goes to engage President Xi. Then you have the Sochi meeting where he sits down with President Putin. Then you have something like the 2+2, which really ramps up the American relationship. You will have some variants of this with Europe and Japan in the balance of the year. So you actually have an ability to play all sides. And I think in many ways, at least in terms of diplomacy today, the country which has the most maneuver, freedom of maneuver, is really the most successful.
But if you look from outside, I think many people who watch India, certainly those who South Asia region, are often confused by the Indian diplomacy, shall we say. I think Wuhan, everybody says, look fantastic, the big breakthrough with China. The next day, 2+2, some interesting things happen. Then Russia. So are we, again, is it a return to confused non-alignment, as some people think, or multi-alignment? Or is it actually a clever navigation of the new situation? Because people are constantly surprised by what your former colleagues do. So how do you read it? Is this, how should we think about this? That is it just a same old, or is it something new?
Well, if you give me two choices and say, is the explanation confusion or cleverness, I would choose cleverness. But for obvious reasons. No, look, seriously, I think today what is happening is really a much more multipolar world, everybody playing everybody to a large extent. And not just us. If you look, things are happening today between China and Japan. Things are happening between Europe and Japan, or between Europe and the United States. So this has become a much more complex game, many more sides to the game. So I'm not sure, that word non-alignment had a certain connotation. It was of a particular era in history. That era was a Cold War and perhaps just a post-Cold War era. Today we are way, that looks light years away. I think it's a far more complicated game, many more sides, many more variables. So I don't think, I don't think these are reactions. I think every country is strategizing. Now, I think to people who don't understand strategy, it may look like confusion. But, don't blame the player, blame the spectator.
Yeah. Now, coming to the specific question of, recently the Quad that took place. Just before that, for months on, the general argument was, look, India is really waffling in the Indo-Pacific. It was not really, doing anything with the Americans. The relationship with the US had plateaued out. And really now it's all about India getting closer to the Russians and the Chinese. And then we see 2+2. Suddenly, there's reference to, all kinds of things, which is quite a fairly surprising in its intensity and in its commitment to the kind of engagement that India seems to be ready with the US. So how should one read it?
Well, okay, let's separate the two.
Yeah.
Okay, the Quad and the 2+2,
yeah,
because they are separate issues. Though 2+2 make 4.
Yeah.
On the Quad, I think a lot of that speculation, frankly, either came from people who didn't understand what was going on, frankly didn't want to understand what was going on. For example, where the Quad is concerned, it actually finds a mention in the 2+2 document. But I give you a sort of a typical comment, okay? I was here, the last time I was here was for the Shangri-La dialogue. And I saw in the Indian papers, people said, Prime Minister Modi didn't mention Quad in the Shangri-La dialogue. So that wasn't exactly my recollection, so I kind of went back and checked the text. And he said, we are happy to work with countries in formats individually, I think bilaterally, and then it says 3 or more. Now, I know I learned mathematics a long time ago, but more than 3 to me was 4. Why I'm saying this is, I think there's a degree of sometimes over-interpretation, sometimes wishful interpretation, sometimes, frankly, agenda-driven interpretation. So my own sense is, look, India has been pretty clear on quadrilateral. Quadrilateral was a diplomatic sort of effort for countries which had converging interests to actually sit down at a sensible senior working level to discuss common concerns. So to say that you didn't use that word, or you didn't meet often enough, or it wasn't the right level, I think quadrilateral is not an industry. I mean, it is a diplomatic convenience in a way. On your other question on the 2+2, look, I saw I was actually in Washington when the 2+2 happened. I tracked it, obviously. And I looked at the outcome document, and as a person who till the beginning of this year was writing or helping to write outcome documents, I am reasonably good at reading them at least and interpreting them. And I was really quite impressed at the I would say the ramping up of the cooperation. I mean the substance of really what it conveyed, when I mean, some of it is a kind of a summary of what has been going on for many years, but some of it is really, in a sense, conceptually and sort of in practically new area. I mean, the fact that today you have India designated as a major defense partner, which was really a term, frankly, invented for India in a way. The fact that your licensing sort of levels have reached what they call STA1, Strategic Trade Authorization 1. The signing of the Kamkaza agreement, and the justification of that, which was that it gives optimal utilization of equipment that India has. The idea that now there is much more talk of industry to industry cooperation, including in innovation. And then if you look in terms of the military to military, the tri-services exercises, the fact that there's cooperation in Western Indian Ocean. Now that's interesting because historically the Americans have had reluctance of India moving into the Central Command area. By and large, they have docketed India into the old Pacific Command. So the acceptance today that India is not kept to that particular limited area, which also means today they are willing to override whatever reservations Pakistan may have on this issue. I think these are really sort of very, very important messages, and some of it, the counter-terrorism bit, the Indo-Pacific bit, these are not completely new, but if you look at the flow of this document, I thought it was a pretty powerful document, a very clear-cut document, a very confident document of what was discussed. And my reading of it today, that when I see it from outside, I would say, look, it would seem to me that it went off very well.
The one issue which, of course, the 2+2 was not meant to deal with was really the question of trade. I mean, that's a different forum, but that's really one of the central features of Trump's policies, and India is not really in sync or alignment, given India's domestic debates on free trade, and all our friends in Southeast Asia know the issues relating to RCEP, etc. How do you square that circle? I mean, that the Trump is demanding a change of the rules, and India still seems to be defending WTO, while actually on the ground the earth is shaking. And then suddenly Mr. Trump tells us actually Indians are ready for a deal. I mean, or Indians at least have offered a deal, at least one of his recent statements. So is there room here for India to reimagine or renegotiate both the trade issue as well as the immigration issue, which you mentioned in your initial remarks?
No, it's public information that, like many other countries, India too is having trade discussions with the United States. So that's not a secret. Now, trade sort of differences on trade are not new. I mean, they have existed before when many of us have served in Washington. Frankly, in the year when I was ambassador, it was one of the dominant issues, and this was before Trump and before the present government in Delhi as well. 301 as well as 332, the Tariff Act. So we've had trade differences. They are long-standing with the United States. They are not, they're not given to easy resolution because there are a lot of complexities out there. I wouldn't define success in a relationship today as saying you agreed on everything. Okay. In fact, it's very interesting. The 2+2, trade does find a mention right at the end of the document. So it to me had kind of there were two messages out there. One, that clearly trade was important. It was politically salient, especially for the American side. But the other, that the US was also willing to see its equities in totality and really recognize the strong security convergences with India as well. I mean, it is not a one-issue relationship with India. So, my own sense is people sometimes underestimate the creativity of systems to find common ground when they wish to find common ground. So I wouldn't necessarily take every tweet at face value, particularly the ones you mentioned. But I would say that I think honest effort is being made to find middle ground.
And the same applies to Iran and Russia, the two issues that were in play before.
I think, again, the two issues are very different. Everybody knows, including in the United States, that we have a long-standing military relationship with Russia that is very critical for India. And I think certainly people have always been conscious of the fact that is one area where India has very strong sensitivities. I think the fact I certainly got the impression that, not from the 2+2, I wasn't there, from Washington, that people recognized and respected that. Okay. The Iran issue, I think, is trickier but again, it's not completely a new issue. I mean, India has been through this earlier. Iran is a very major oil supplier to India. So I don't think it's such an easy issue either.
No, I think because the U.S. policy towards South Asia is not just about India. There is Afghanistan, there is Pakistan. On all the reports on Afghanistan, I mean, a year after President defined his strategy, there is a suspicion or expectation in some quarters that Trump is ready to cut and not run, maybe bad word, but that trying to cut their losses and head home. Because we all know that Trump was really not very enthusiastic about the military guys telling him, stick around, put more troops, keep fighting this war. Is already in the 18th year. So are we heading for the exits in Afghanistan?
No, look, I'm not sure. I think you are putting it very sharply, and I'm not sure that is necessarily the sort of reality out there. I don't think for US it is go or stay. I think there are issues of what numbers, what posture, what is the ground situation out there. Because do remember, this is also the same president who said with respect to Iraq that it was a big mistake to have left, and we helped to create the ISIS out there. And today he actually has forces committed in Syria. So I'm not, again, I would suggest to you the realities are far more complex than the headlines in this case.
So, but the Afghanistan issue, I think quite clearly is linked to what the US relationship with Pakistan. I think if we go back from 79 onwards, really what happened in Afghanistan was the defining factor in the US-Pakistan relationship. So now, in last year when Trump announced the strategy, he was very, very critical of Pakistan. Since then, they put some pressure on Pakistan, whether it was on terrorism issue. Now, when Mr. Pompeo, the US Secretary of State, went to meet Imran Khan, I think there's talk about a reset. Is it diplomatic nicety, or is there really a room for a reset between the two of them, given what's happening in Pakistan and in Washington?
Hey, look, that's honestly a difficult question, because what happens every time there is, Pakistan is actually a kind of a business for optimists. So you have to tell yourself every time there's change, maybe there's something better out there. And it's not, Indians have to be particularly optimistic, but I think the rest of the world today has increasingly come around to that. So people always would tend to say, okay, there's a change, so let's see whether there's something out there. But at the end of the day, there are structural realities in every relationship.
One of the things we've seen between U.S. approach to India and Pakistan, and I think it looked like, from the Clinton administration time, everything is, you couldn't think of India without thinking of Pakistan. Then we had Bush, who kind of dehyphenated the relationship. But today, Trump seems to have gone one step further, in a way, rehyphenating, but saying India must play a role in Afghanistan, or that, separating and putting India on a different pedestal. Is that found hope in Delhi, or is it a way of fundamental change has taken place, how U.S. looks at Pakistan and India?
No, look, India was always active in Afghanistan. The issue was really what was the American approach towards Indian activities. When it started, America, frankly, was less understanding. In fact, America was quite discouraging of many things. We were, even many of our aid programs in Afghanistan. So today when people say you're doing a great job in Afghanistan, partly it was because we didn't listen to people who told us not to do it, and we did what was in Afghan interest and what was in Indian interest. So the US would have its ups and downs, because the US would look at it from a variety of perspectives, including its relationship with Pakistan. But for the Indians, we have stakes, we have genuine stakes in Afghanistan. And, we have plowed a fairly steady course out there.
But the way the US had dealt with, they always used to come and say, talk to Pakistan, its regional stability, nuclear escalation. That seems to have followed.
That has changed, and it has also changed from US coming to us, and instead US tweeting to everybody in the world. So that, it's both the style, the substance, the message, all of that has undergone a shift.
No, while Pakistan has gone down in the trilateral, in our relationship with in India's relationship with the US, there is also the rise of the new Indo-Pacific as a factor. Does that lead to where US is looking at South Asia from a very different perspective, where large parts of South Asia, not just India. I see there's a step up in the US engagement with Sri Lanka on the naval issue. It's willing to push back on the CPEC. So there is a sense, does the Indo-Pacific mark the beginning of a new framing from the US about the region?
See, the Indo-Pacific is a very interesting concept, because it's actually been around for many years. It's been there certainly in India for maybe 10 years now. In fact, I think, if I'm not mistaken, your own book about 10 years ago used the term Indo-Pacific. I remember even in the previous government, there were occasions when it was there, used by the then Prime Minister. I think the Japanese have used it, maybe not exactly using those words, but if you remember, Abe's speech was about the confluence of the two seas. So the idea has been around. I think what has changed is now in a sense, the Americans have come on board. So people think it's a new idea because the Americans have come on board, and that gives it a degree of prominence perhaps which it didn't have earlier. But at the end of the day, it is essentially a statement today that it's very difficult to deal with the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean in a very compartmentalized form, and that there are countries whose interests span both. So I think it's partly a recognition of a reality as much as it is a new concept.
Just one last question, and then before we can go to the floor and get the audience to participate in this conversation. Some people believe that, look, given what's happening between US and China, then India's drawing closer to the US, Pakistan reaching out to Russia, China-Russia relationship, that it's really fundamentally altering the structure of the region. I mean, that's one part, the international relations of the region. The second is regions, as you know, expand, contract, depending on the circumstance. and say some people worry that, look, South Asia is actually fragmenting, that you have the eastern part of the subcontinent drawing more closer to the, through the Indo-Pacific, or the BIMSTEC, or a whole lot of new arrangements that we're trying to do. That given the dynamic situation in the US policy, China's rise, where do you see South Asia's future? Is really, South Asia word didn't exist, say, when you joined the Foreign Service. Say, at the time, they talked about subcontinent, they talked about India, perhaps they talked about Pakistan, Seato, CENTO. There was no South Asia. After all, Pakistan was part of the Southeast Asia security architecture. So are we witnessing a fundamental change in the geopolitics of our region, and that this region is going to be very different from the conventional thinking that has settled on our minds for the last 30, 40 years?
Again, I think we need to differentiate between some of the optics and some of the politicking and the fundamentals. When you take India-US, it may have its ups and downs, but there is a structural solidity to it. I would say that is even more so with India-Russia. I mean, if you look at Russia's interest in South Asia, in the Indian subcontinent, actually you put the rest of the subcontinent together, multiplied by 100, it still doesn't come anywhere close to the kind of interest that Russia has in India. So you get a lot of this saying that people are reaching out to each other. This is the new world. This is the different world. That in the old days, there were clear-cut positions, there were limits to maneuverability. People didn't have the courage or the imagination or the benefits of reaching out. I mean, today, it's a far looser world, so that is happening. But because people are reaching out, relationships are not going to change overnight. They're not going to change dramatically. Relationships need to be built. I mean, you look at our own relationship with the United States. It has not happened in the last 3 years or 5 years, or I would say even 10 years. It has happened really over a fairly long period of time. And, I saw a very interesting number, which in some ways indicates how India-US relationship grows, which is the number of Indians who are citizens of America. And it was 3,000 when Pandit Nehru visited America. It was 30,000 when Indira Gandhi visited America.
It was
300,000 when Rajiv Gandhi visited America. It was 3.3 million when Modi visited America. Now, see, that's a reality. So there will be ups and downs. So I think when we should kind of differentiate, sort of, in a sense, some of the market play, or the marketing of a happening from actually the realities of what is happening out there. On the bit of, the fragmentation of the region, I don't think the region is fragmenting. I think there is actually a center of the region, which for obvious reasons happens to be India. I mean, you look at the economic and structural linkages between all India's neighbors and India. I mean, it is very clear that those relationships are actually getting deeper. Now, there are new factors arising, including China's growing presence in some of these countries. But because China is growing, people sometimes don't look at whether India is growing with these countries. I mean, some of us have lived in the neighboring countries of India. I mean, it would be inconceivable for them really to sort of think of their daily life without the relationship with India which they have. So at times I think we sort of underestimate as India the value that we have, our salience in their lives, including their economic lives. And I think today the building of connectivity and greater market mobility out there, that is actually drawing, in my view, the region is actually for the first time acquiring a sense of regionalism, or at least moving towards.
Yeah. Okay, gentlemen, the floor is open, so we look forward to sharp comments or short and difficult questions, if you have any, to the Ambassador Jaishankar. So to Ravi. Yeah.
Dr. Jaishankar, you just come back from DC. What is your assessment of the stability of the Trump administration, and what are the chances that there could be a surprise there? And what should we prepare for if something like that happens? What kind of president would, let's say, Pence be for Asia?
Just an impeachment away from White House. It's just
Forget America for the moment. Look at the state of the world. If we look at the volatility in the world today, I think 2 or 3 years ago, none of us thought we could have handled this. Okay, I mean, the word new normal actually has a strong connotation. Now, new normal applies even more to the state of American politics. A lot of things which America felt were not handleable, that it has actually kind of exceeded the traditional bandwidth. So, in a sense, yes, American politics is in ferment. There are many things happening. There are very novel things. You get very dramatic predictions. And the next day is not, it's a bit like, Groundhog Day, sort of the next day is more drama, not dissimilar drama. And we say, okay, the next day will be different. That's not that different from the previous day. So I think we just have to accept today that American politics has assumed a certain direction and go with it. So now, some of the things which you are saying, sure, I read the same newspapers as you do, but it's a very interesting thing today with media, and you have to, maybe I shouldn't be saying this to you, but look back at what people are saying, and see how accurate they are. It's a very interesting exercise.
okay, Dr. Rani, I'll come back to you.
Thank you. It's been a year since Trump's new South Asia policy, and in many ways, the biggest change in the policy has been with regard to Pakistan. I mean, the metrics for engagement in Afghanistan were changed, deepening with India, but with regard to Pakistan, especially in the wake of Steve Cole and Carlotta Gall's books, I think there's been increasing sort of public upbraiding, if you will, of Pakistan. But the result of that seems to be also one of driving Pakistan more deeply into the arms of China. And there's worry about that, I think, both on the US and on the Indian side. And I'm wondering whether there's any evaluation or reevaluation going on in terms of how to keep Pakistan engaged, both on the US side as well as on the Indian side. Thanks. As many of you know, or maybe some of you know, I was in ISAS, resident in ISAS till a few months ago. And when I was leaving here, actually Rani gave me Carlotta Gall's book, The Wrong Enemy, as a kind of going away reading. Now, this book, for those of you who haven't read it, actually brings out how deeply the sort of the double game, if you would, Pakistan was playing on Afghanistan. And the book made a lot of waves, okay? Now, I read the book. It's a very well-written book, very easy read. To me, the biggest surprise of the book was that for an Indian, it came as no surprise at all. There's something which was so glaringly obvious to us was rocket science for the Americans. And that told me so much about America. And in a sense, this was America I dealt with in the foreign ministry, which sort of closed its eyes to some very obvious happenings out there, and then obviously is finding it a novel discovery after a certain passage of time when it's really too late to repair the damage of that closing of the eyes out there. There have been some very good books written about Pakistan, about this period. Carlotta Gall's book is one. Hussain Haqqani had a great book before that. There's a book about the Pakistani army written by Christine Faye, which kind of gives you a mindset, which I think few other authors have been able to describe so effectively. The reason I'm saying this is, look, this is what you are saying, in a sense, is exactly the game which Pakistan has played, which is, I will be doing a lot of things, but if you call me out on it, it'll be embarrassing for you and it'll be embarrassing for me. So why don't we all pretend that I'm not doing it and life will go on happily thereafter? The fact is, it's all out in the open, and you have today a president in the United States who is not politically correct and therefore doesn't seem to want to shut his eyes to it. So beginning with the tweet at the beginning, at the start of the year, he's been saying things about Pakistan which typically American presidents didn't say. But, that emperor, it took a kid to say the emperor had no clothes. Sometimes it takes an outlier to describe a situation which all of us know is for real, but political correctness in America prevented people, or vested interest, call it what you would, prevented people from saying so. So I think today there is a reality out there to be recognized that is far more important. It's better to have the difficulties of the right diagnosis than the comfort of a wrong one.
Dalji, yeah, I'll come to you. Yeah, next to you. Right.
There is this talk, maybe loose talk sometimes, that public opinion in the US has gradually turned quite strongly against foreign overseas military or security engagements for economic and other reasons. Now, are there any reliable or recent indicators of foreign opinion, public opinion on this score? And in this context, can the US sustain a strong reaction to the challenge of China over time? I think that's quite a fundamental issue.
Yeah, but I would say I think we need to kind of distinguish between these issues. If any society has prolonged military commitment over a period of time, it is natural that there would be reactions to it. Now the US has been really fighting in Afghanistan for 18 years, 17 years, in Iraq for a substantial period of time. So, you could see reactions to that. But do understand, the challenge of China is not being dealt with by the United States in a military way. In fact, precisely for the reason that you have outlined, actually today the responses to the challenge of China is coming through economic, technological, political instruments rather than this. You can be fatigued with a troop commitment, but it's not. That's not the same as saying I'm fatigued with being number one in the world. And if you're number one in the world, you're going to have to protect that number one position by dealing with challenges to be number one. So I would make that difference. So I'm not sure. If you ask me, are there people who feel, okay, true, US has had excessive troop commitments? By the way, Trump himself says US has had excessive troop commitments, yes. But if you ask Trump, therefore, would you say, let's America resign to not being number one in the world? He'd say no.
I think the question is how to exercise hegemony, not whether to exercise hegemony. So the question is, it's about tactics and strategy. Amitabh? Yeah.
Dr. Jaishankar, specific to trade, India announced retaliatory tariffs after the US announced the steel and aluminium tariff hikes, which were held back in the first round because there were negotiations, and now they're supposed to come into effect from next week. So my question is two-part. Do you expect the tariffs to actually come into effect from India's side? And if not, what are the specific concessions that India might have to make, or what might it expect the US to give it to it so that they are kept on hold?
Look, I would honestly hesitate to give you a clear-cut answer, because I will give you the most honest response. I don't know, which people normally hesitate to say. I don't know, because not being in the government, I don't know what were actually the status of discussions between the USTR and the Department of Commerce. I do know there have been multiple rounds of discussions. All I can say is I can extrapolate from previous experience when I was in the government, and I would say generally with major trade accounts, the inclination would be to find common ground, if at all that is possible. People do not rush into confrontational responses as the first option. I think the endeavor would be, let's see if we can kind of work it out. And again, I did note, because to me it stood out a bit, that even in the 2+2, they are talking of their hope of finding a mutually acceptable outcome for the discussions between Commerce and USTR.
Anand, you had any question on the same subject?
The question was, just as President Trump was an outsider in the Republican Party, do you see the risk of either an Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders taking the Democratic Party out of its center-left position to a decidedly leftist socialist position as we approach 2020 or 21 elections? Yeah.
The DSA, the Democratic Socialist Association.
My sense of where capital D democratic politics stand is that the picture will clear up after the November elections. Because I think you would see personalities, or you could see personalities coming who would be of a sort of national caliber if there are some upsets or some sort of prominent results. So at this stage, we are, both saying Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders because we are thinking of the last election, and once you removed Hillary Clinton from the equation, these are the two default names which kind of come to fore. If you look at the history of American politics, it has this ability to consistently kind of throw up new candidates, usually about 2 to 4 years before a presidential election. So I would imagine that, sort of post November, that question would become, if there isn't anybody dramatically new, you are looking in perhaps in the right direction, but there could be a very different answer.
Amit Mishra.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Jaishankar, for the interesting sharing. I think we are all very proud of the fact that someone was posted to Singapore became the Foreign Secretary of India.
Thank you.
My question is on the Iranian issue.
It was all Singapore's doing.
Yeah. Okay, my question is on the Iranian issue. Just in case Pakistan closed down the NATO supply routes, an option is available in Iran whereby India can use Chabahar hard port to supply non-lethal weapons to Afghanistan. I mean, if you look at the hawks in America, even people like Professor Christine Fair thinks that that US should have better relations with Iran, because of what's going on in Afghanistan. Well, I think it's not very wise for the Americans to antagonize Pakistan, Iran, and Turkey at the same time. Of course, there's a deficit of human intelligence in the White House these days. Okay, but the thing is that as India has this.
You already asked one question.
Can we come to the question?
Okay, can India? Do you think India can play the role of a conduit between United States and Iran in the future? Just another point I just want to make is that now in a growing multipolar world, India has the desire to be one of the poles in a multipolar world, and there's also this theory that the United States wants to use India to contain the rise of China, and since India's they experienced through the non-aligned movement, do you think that India is then moving to a camp of the United States? And do you think India should have a more balanced policy between the United States and China? Thank you.
I think the balance would tilt it in the US favor probably.
Look, one, if you are saying, does the solution to America's problems lie in Pakistan, lie in Iran? You have to look at the state of US-Iran relations. And I think the answer given, Christine Fair may have a view. Donald Trump has a different view. And at the moment, Donald Trump's views are the ones which count. So given the state of US-Iran relations, I think any thoughts along the lines you're suggesting are really not just hypothetical. I think they are kind of far out. On the issue of, is somebody using us to contain the rise of another country? Look, we are using the whole world to facilitate our own rise. I mean, that's what international relations is about. I mean, and the question is not do you balance. You are sort of trying to apply a 1950s, 60s syndrome to a world situation 50 years later. The name of the game is no longer there are not two camps to balance. There are multiple centers, and that's what I've taken some pains to explain. That everybody is dealing with everybody, and really no, since you used the word intelligent, no intelligent power certainly would like to leave one particular option completely constrained. So it is not in India's interest to see its relationship with China go down, but it is in India's interest to make sure that all its other relationships help India go up. So that is today the new kind of global politics.
Yeah, Deepinder, you wanted to come.
Thank you, Dr. Jaishankar. On the question of how to exercise hegemony, in the past, whenever the US has...
He used that word, huh?
He knows that, well, indeed. In the past, whenever there have been sanctions imposed on any state, it's been on account of egregious human rights violations, or there's some broad concurrence, either by Universal Accord or the US persuading. With the Iran instance, it's a situation where every other partner in the negotiations, including the IAEA, has vehemently disagrees with the unilateralism. And this is imposing serious cost on all the allies. Investments in the EU made for India, it's oil and of course Chabahar. My question is, do you see a point, a threshold beyond which these unilateral measures in trade, sanctions, can result in a pushback, or do you see the green shoots of anything of the sort coming up?
No, look, if you were to look at the issue in a somewhat abstract form, I think if I remember right, John Connolly, who was the Treasury Secretary, said that the dollar is our currency but your problem. So the fact that, the part of being the number one power is when you have the reserve currency of the world, out of this came a term in international relations called weaponization of finance. So it's an instrument which, this particular country has used, because this country has that very unique instrument at its command. I do think the situation now is somewhat different, because earlier on, because your reference to Iran, earlier on there was a much greater global consensus and Europe was fully on board. And there were certain United Nations resolutions which at least had a certain relevance to the issue. I think today we are not exactly in replicating that situation. I think the politics of it is also very different. I'm really quite, right now very agnostic about where this issue is going.
Juma, did you have?
Thank you very much. As a seasoned diplomat, you have seen all these structures, but you said something about the rise of Asia, and the rise of Asia has only just begun. I can remember the days when India and China would say, Hindi, Chini, bhai, bhai. Maybe let's come back again someday. So it's a very short while that Asia is on the rise. Do you agree that we've got a long way to go, and it's in the interest of India and China and any other Asian powers that come to be to see that this is not disrupted? Thank you.
I would share with you an observation which Professor Wangwangu gave when I was with him at the Hindustan Times Summit earlier this year. He said, we in Asia have, unfortunately, inevitably imported nationalism from Europe. So, in a sense, today we talk of Asia, but the fact is there's the reality of nationalism in Europe, and handling the nationalism is a challenge in itself.
Jivanta, yeah.
Last question? Okay. Thank you for squeezing me in. In all the talk about the Indo-Pacific, one hears a lot about the centrality of ASEAN and Southeast Asia, and there seems to have been a lot of focus on that part of the Indo-Pacific. Do you think, if we look further west, the Western Indian Ocean is going to get far more attention in the near future? If we think of developments in Djibouti, competition on the islands, is that going to be the theater where some more action is going to happen, and especially with India's ability to influence that region more perhaps than this part of the world where we're sitting in? Thank you.
Well, it's interesting you should raise that, because actually historically people have not paid much importance to Western Indian Ocean. It's actually, Indians have for very different reasons, but other than Indians, people looked at the Gulf but not really at Western Indian Ocean in that sense. But I would also sort of underline that, in fact, in the 2+2, one of the formulations is advancing a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific region based on recognition of ASEAN centrality and on respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, etc., etc. Today, I can't speak for the Americans, but certainly for the Indians today, the cohesion and the centrality of ASEAN is very important, because at the end of the day, in a sense, I go back to Mr. Jumabhoi's observation. People in this region don't fully understand the magnitude of their achievement. They are the only people in Asia who've been able to build a reasonable, lasting transnational mechanism, which has become the basis for a bigger global gathering. Today, if you look at it, the EAS is a very unique organization. And the EAS at the top is based, its foundations are really the ASEAN. If there was no ASEAN, there'd be no EAS. So the fact is, it is because ASEAN has held, ASEAN has grown, from ASEAN, ARF came, EAS came. So you may grumble about, not you specifically, people may grumble about the limitations of all of this, but there is no other game in town. So there is a uniqueness, there is a value, it is an irreplaceable institution, and today, in fact, I would say almost a culture where there is a gathering of nations who try to at least meet, find common ground. So I would say, when you compare Eastern Indian Ocean to Western Indian Ocean, one, if you look at the demographics, the economy, the demographics, the architectural value of Eastern Southeast Asia and what comes out of it, and it has its fair share of disputes. South China Sea is going to make sure that you are never out of the news. So trust me on that. So I'm not sure there is anything comparable either in value or in challenge on the other extremity of the Indian Ocean. Yes, there are issues now like Djibouti which are new, and I suspect there'll be inevitably more issues as Indian Ocean becomes more active. But it is I would still say, value for value, to me, this is pretty unique, Southeast Asia.
I think I'll just take one last question, and Ambassador Jaishankar has to leave. Yes, sir, please.
Thank you. I'm from the ASEAN Studies Center, and I thank you, Dr. Jaishankar, for your kind words about ASEAN. But we heard that President Trump will skip both the ASEAN-US Summit, EAS, and he will not also go to APEC. So that doesn't say much about respecting ASEAN centrality.
No, I'm talking for myself.
And In ASEAN, I understand that there is no consensus just yet on what to or how to respond to the Indo-Pacific. But Indonesia seems to be interested in pushing its own version of what it calls as ASEAN-led Indo-Pacific concept. I think it's a concept paper is being circulated for discussion. But my question to you is to follow up on your first point. You just went to Washington, D.C., and you said nobody you know seemed to know what is going on. I would like to ask you...
I have new friends now. They know.
I would like to ask you about your friends in the diplomatic circle. What do they think about the article in the New York Times? Whether it reflects the factual situation in the Trump administration, and do you have your own suspect in mind who might be the author of that article?
You know, I read the article like you did. I read all the articles about the article like you did. The hypothetical list of who could have written it like you did. So I really don't, there's nothing I know which you don't know.
Okay, I think that's a good note to the uncertainty. That there are things that we don't know in the US, which is what makes our life quite interesting, I think, in the days ahead. So I just want to say a couple of things at the end. I mean, I think one, what has come through Ambassador Jaishankar's talk is really the growing salience of South Asia in the global politics, certainly in the politics of Asia, of the Indo-Pacific. For long, I think South Asia was marginal to the calculations, but today we talk about rise of Asia, there is also an emergence of South Asia, you can say. It's not just India. The growth in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, a lot of things are happening. So you'd see, I think, there's going to be a lot more effect of South Asia on the world, and this is a new element. And I think as the Institute of South Asian Studies, I think we are deeply committed to looking at the emerging trends and of change in South Asia's role, as well as the kind of things that South Asia might be called upon to do in the coming years. Second, we want to thank all of you, I think, for being so supportive. We did a lot of events last month, but I think we hope to do more, not in terms of numbers, but in terms of more interactive sessions of the kind that we had today. I mean, I think we need to do a lot more smaller events, which is more of discussions, of roundtables, of conversations. Hopefully, as the region gets more exciting, the way we do things and what we present to you would also become more attractive to a lot more of you. So finally, I mean, I think it's a pleasant duty to thank Ambassador Jaishankar for giving us such insights today. He's still associated with us. You talked about in past tense, but he's
I said my residence. Okay. I was very careful.
So Ambassador Jaishankar is the honorary fellow of ISAS, and I think it's ISAS's own network has grown, and we hope that we'll be able to better bring the network of the last 15 years that we've created to bring to bear on what we do and how we do it in the coming years. Please join me in thanking Ambassador Jaishankar for being with us.